The first thing Evelyn noticed was the smell. Not grief, not flowers, not old wood in a southern house that had been breathing swamp air for decades, but bleach. Too much of it. It clung to the hallway like a lie that had been scrubbed into the walls. The second thing was the latch on her mother's bedroom window. It had been replaced. New metal, too bright against the weathered frame, as if someone had fixed it in a hurry and hoped no one would look closely. And the third thing was the thin red line on the edge of the kitchen counter, half cleaned, half dried, catching the morning light like a warning she was not supposed to see. Evelyn had driven back to Bayou Levau under a sky the color of bruised steel, the highway cutting through flat fields and waterlogged trees that leaned as if they were tired of holding themselves upright. She had told herself she was returning for one thing only, to bury her mother and close the chapter of a life that had always felt slightly too heavy for the body carrying it. She had told herself she would do the funeral, handle paperwork, lock the door, and never come back. She had repeated it like a prayer, because if she allowed even a second of softness, the place would swallow her again. The town greeted her with the same quiet hunger it had always had. People did not ask questions directly. They let sympathy do it for them. A hand held too long on her shoulder at the church. A look that lingered on her suitcase like it was measuring how long she would stay. A neighbor offering casserole while her eyes tracked the porch, the mailbox, the bank notices that already overflowed the slot. In Bayou Levau, grief was public currency. Everyone spent it, everyone collected it, and everyone expected interest. Her mother's funeral was small, polite, and drained of truth. There were hymns, whispered condolences, and a priest who spoke about peace like it was a place someone could simply walk into. Evelyn listened, nodded when she had to, and held her face together because the moment she let it crack, people would read too much into the shape of it. She knew what they would say if she looked too angry, if she looked too afraid, if she looked relieved. Any emotion would become a story, and stories in that town did not die when the person did. After the last handshake and the last forced smile, she went back to the house on the swamp's edge. The yard was soft underfoot, a wet sponge of earth and dead leaves. The porch steps creaked the same way they had when she was a teenager sneaking out at night, except now the sound felt like accusation. She unlocked the door and was hit again by the bleach, by the sense that someone had been there recently, moving through rooms that belonged to the dead with the confidence of the living. It was supposed to be empty. Her mother had lived alone. Evelyn had been the distant daughter, the one who sent money when she could and called when she remembered, the one who moved to Dallas to escape a town that never forgot. She had expected dust and stillness. Instead, she found evidence of management. Curtains drawn with intention. Dishes washed, stacked, aligned. A chair in the living room shifted an inch from where her childhood memory insisted it should be. Small details that did not matter, except they meant someone had cared enough to reset the scene. On the kitchen table sat a folder she did not recognize. It was plain manila, thick, the corners too sharp to belong in that house. A paperclip held a single page on top, a typed list of necessary steps after a death with checkboxes already marked in clean blue ink. Funeral home contacted, mortgage servicer notified, utilities transferred, insurance claims initiated. It read like competence, like help, like something her mother would never have had the energy for. Evelyn stared at it until her stomach tightened. Her mother had not had this kind of help, not without a cost. She spent the afternoon doing what grief demanded, sorting, packing, avoiding the moment when she would have to sit down and truly understand that her mother was gone. She opened drawers, found old receipts, a cracked photo frame, a stack of letters from banks with threatening language softened by corporate politeness. Past due, final notice, intent to foreclose. She was not surprised. The house had been held together for years by her mother's stubbornness and Evelyn's occasional wire transfers. It had always been a slow collapse. Then she found the safe. It was hidden behind a loose panel in the closet, exactly where her mother had once shown her in a rare moment of trust. Evelyn remembered the scent of mothballs and perfume, her mother's hands shaking as she dialed the code, the warning that some things were safer locked away even from family. Evelyn expected jewelry, maybe deeds, maybe the kind of secrets older women kept when they had no one else to rely on. She opened it and found contracts. Not one, several, neatly stacked, labeled, dated, legal language dense enough to make the eyes slide off it. At the top of each was the seal of a private trust, the kind of organization that existed to make rich people richer without appearing greedy. The name hit her like a cold slap, Crawford Family Trust. She had heard it before, in the same way everyone in southern towns heard about powerful names. Not through direct contact, but through rumor, charity galas, newspaper headlines about donations to hospitals and scholarship funds. Crawford was a name spoken with respect, because respect was safer than curiosity. Her mother's signature sat at the bottom of the first document, careful and slightly shaky, as if she had written it with fear sitting on her wrist. Next to it was a notary stamp and an attorney's signature she did not recognize. Evelyn flipped through pages and felt the air in the closet grow thinner. The contract was not a loan, not in the normal sense. It read like assistance, like support, like temporary relief, in exchange for non-monetary consideration that would be determined upon triggering conditions. It was a trap made to look like mercy. On the last page, in smaller font, there was a clause that made her hands go numb. It discussed succession of obligations. It stated that if the primary party became incapacitated or deceased, the obligations transferred to the designated beneficiary. Evelyn's name was typed there, crisp and undeniable. Beneath that was one more sentence, one that did not belong among the polite language. The consideration could be fulfilled through marriage, cohabitation, or a binding partnership arrangement at the discretion of the trust. Her throat tightened. She read it again, and again, as if repetition would turn it into something else. She did not hear the car outside. She did not hear the steps on the porch. She only realized she was not alone when the house shifted around her, the way buildings did when a new presence entered and claimed space. A knock sounded at the front door, then another, not aggressive, not uncertain, controlled. Evelyn closed the safe with fingers that did not feel like hers. She stood, wiped her palms on her jeans, and walked through the hallway as if her legs belonged to someone else. The bleach smell followed her, thick and sharp. She opened the door. The man on her porch did not look like a stranger wandering into the wrong life. He looked like the end of a sentence that had started long before she arrived. Nathan Crawford stood in a dark suit that belonged more in a courtroom or a boardroom than on a damp Louisiana porch. The humidity should have ruined his composure, but it didn't. His hair was dry, his collar crisp. He carried no umbrella even though the air promised rain. Behind him, a black SUV idled at the edge of the yard, too clean for the mud, too quiet for the neighborhood. His face was the kind people trusted on magazine covers. Strong jaw, calm eyes, the faint softness of someone who smiled for donors and cameras. But the calm was not warmth. It was precision. He looked like a man who understood exactly what effect he had on rooms and used it without apology. Evelyn's brain reached for memories and came up empty. She had never met him, yet something in her body reacted as if she had. A tightening under her ribs, a sense of being measured. He stepped forward slightly, not crossing the threshold, but making it clear the threshold was irrelevant. His gaze moved over her shoulder into the house, not intrusively, just as if he had already been inside and was confirming that everything was in place. Evelyn felt her anger try to rise and fail. It was hard to be furious when fear was doing such an efficient job. She did not invite him in. She did not have to. He entered with the ease of someone who had never been told no in a way that mattered. The porch boards creaked under his shoes like a quiet surrender. He carried a folder, black leather, the kind executives used to carry the world's uglier decisions in a way that looked respectable. He set it on the small table by the door as if the house had been waiting for it. His movements were gentle. Not kind, but controlled, a softness designed to prevent resistance from forming. Evelyn's gaze flicked to the SUV outside. The driver remained inside, engine running. A choice, not necessity. A reminder that Nathan did not arrive alone. She told herself to breathe. She told herself to stay sharp. People like him fed on panic. Nathan's eyes returned to her face. He looked at her the way investors looked at buildings they planned to renovate, assessing foundation, damage, potential value, and what might need to be removed. In that first minute, the hook of her new reality sank deep. Her mother's death stopped feeling like the worst thing that had happened. It began to look like a doorway someone had opened from the other side. Evelyn led him into the living room because refusing felt like a childish gesture, and she refused to be reduced to that. The air in the house felt colder there, as if the walls recognized him. He sat without being asked, choosing the chair that faced the hallway and the front door at the same time. Positioning. Habit. Evelyn remained standing. She kept distance between them. She watched him watch her. Nathan opened his leather folder and removed documents that looked identical to those in the safe. He placed them on the coffee table with care, aligning edges. The ritual of it was almost intimate, almost obscene, like he was laying out a body for inspection. Evelyn's eyes burned. She wanted to demand how he knew about the safe, about her mother's signature, about her name typed into a clause that tasted like ownership. But she held her tongue long enough to learn. She knew questions could be weapons, and she needed hers to land. Nathan's attention slid briefly toward the hallway, toward the kitchen, toward the bedrooms. He did not need to speak to show he knew the layout. Evelyn understood then why the chair had been moved, why the bleach smell had been so heavy. Someone had prepared the house to receive him, or to receive her under his control. Her thoughts raced back to small moments from her mother's last months. The short calls where her mother sounded exhausted, but oddly relieved. The vague reassurances that things were handled. The sudden repairs that had appeared without explanation. The fact that foreclosure had never happened even when the bank notices screamed it should have. Evelyn had assumed her mother had found a miracle. Now she saw the shape of it. Miracles did not come with legal seals. She reached for one of the documents on the table, not to read, but to confirm the paper's reality. The weight of it was wrong, too official, too final. She scanned the first page and saw the same phrasing: assistance, relief, discretion. The words were polite, but their arrangement was predatory, a perfect legal cage. Then she saw something else. A signature line at the bottom that did not belong to her mother. It was blank, labeled for the beneficiary. Her hands tightened. She did not sign anything, not yet, but the fact that the line existed meant the plan had been designed from the beginning with her in mind. Her mother had not merely borrowed against the house. She had promised her daughter's future without telling her, or she had been forced to. Evelyn looked up. Nathan's gaze held steady, almost patient, like he was giving her time to accept the inevitable. That patience was not mercy, it was confidence. Outside, thunder rolled far away, low and slow, as if the sky was rehearsing what it would do later. The windows dimmed slightly under a passing cloud. The house felt like it leaned inward, listening. Evelyn's mind tried to find a rational path out. She could reject it. She could walk away. She could let the bank take the house and let her mother's memory dissolve into mold and debt. She could return to Dallas and pretend none of this touched her. But the contract's clause was there for a reason. It would not end with property. It would follow her. It would turn into lawsuits, liens, frozen accounts, credit destroyed, employers called, reputations quietly poisoned. A trust like Crawford's did not need to threaten loudly. It could crush a person with paperwork and time. It could do it while smiling for donors. Evelyn pictured her mother signing. She pictured the fear in that shaky line of ink. She pictured her mother sitting across from someone like Nathan, being offered salvation with a blade hidden inside it. Evelyn's grief sharpened into something darker than sadness. It became rage with nowhere to go. Nathan's eyes moved again, briefly, to her hands, to the way she held the paper. He noted her tension like a doctor noting symptoms. Evelyn finally sat, not because she wanted to, but because she refused to look like she was about to run. The chair across from him felt like a confession. She studied him as if she could find an obvious flaw. A twitch, a crack in composure, something human. What she found instead was a man who had learned to perform humanity without needing to feel it. His calm was the calm of someone who had already decided the ending and was simply guiding others toward it. The hook tightened further, stretching into the next minute, then the next. Because Evelyn realized this was not just about a house. The house was a symbol, a doorway. If she lost it, she lost the last piece of her mother. If she kept it, she might lose herself. And beneath everything else, beneath the legal language and the polite trap, there was a quieter, uglier implication she could not ignore. Her mother had died with this contract still active, meaning either she had never managed to pay the price or she had tried to get out and failed. Evelyn glanced again at the window latch, the too new metal catching gray light. She remembered the red line on the counter. She remembered the bleach. Her pulse kicked harder. The town's quiet hunger suddenly made sense. They were not just curious about her grief. They were waiting to see whether she would become the next part of the Crawford story. In Bayou Levau, everyone knew when power moved. They simply pretended they didn't. Evelyn's phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She ignored it. The sound felt irrelevant next to the weight in the room. Nathan did not glance at it, but his stillness suggested he had heard it and filed it away. Somewhere outside, the SUV's engine remained steady, a low purr like a restrained animal. The driver did not move. The vehicle waited as if it had all day. Evelyn looked down at the papers and saw a second document clipped behind the first, an outline of next steps, the same style as the checklist folder she had found earlier. It included appointments with attorneys, a meeting with a bank representative, a scheduled travel date to New Orleans for formalization. It was dated for the coming week, as if she had already agreed. That was when her fear turned into something colder. Not panic, clarity. Someone had planned her week before she arrived at her mother's funeral. Someone had cleaned the house, moved a chair, replaced a window latch, prepared paperwork, and sent Nathan Crawford to sit in her living room like he belonged there. It was too organized to be opportunistic. It felt like execution of a script. Evelyn's gaze lifted to him again. For a fraction of a second, she thought she saw it. Not softness, not kindness, but satisfaction. The quiet satisfaction of a man watching a door close behind someone. She understood then why the clause had sounded like a legal formality until it didn't. Formalities were how powerful people committed violence without leaving visible bruises. Evelyn sat in her mother's living room with her mother's house breathing around her, and she felt the future narrow to a single corridor. One end of it was poverty, ruin, disappearance. The other end of it was Nathan Crawford. And the worst part was that Nathan did not need to grab her. He had already done it. With ink, with seals, with a contract that had been signed in blood long before any pen touched paper. She leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on the signature line that carried her name. The paper did not tremble. Her hands did not shake. She did not give the room the satisfaction of seeing her break. But inside, something fractured anyway. Not her will. Her illusion that she had arrived too late to stop the worst thing from happening. The worst thing had not happened at the funeral. It had happened in the quiet months before her mother died, when a desperate woman had been cornered and forced to bargain with a man who could afford to call himself a savior. Evelyn realized she had inherited more than a house. She had inherited a trap that had already closed. And somewhere in the back of her mind, another thought formed, sharp and sickening. If her mother had agreed to this, it meant she had been protecting Evelyn from something even worse. Or she had been trying to buy time. Evelyn stared at Nathan Crawford and understood that time had run out. Evelyn arrived at Nathan Crawford's estate under a sky too clean to be comforting. The road leading to the property was smooth and private, bordered by manicured trees that looked natural only because someone had spent years forcing them to grow that way. The iron gates opened before the car fully stopped, not hurried, not hesitant, as if her arrival had been calculated down to the second. She watched them part and understood that this was not a home that welcomed people. It processed them. The mansion revealed itself gradually, designed to impress without appearing desperate for admiration. Pale stone, wide terraces, glass that reflected the world but did not invite it inside. Everything about the place suggested permanence, stability, and money that had never known panic. Evelyn felt the difference immediately. Her mother's house had been held together by effort and fear. This one stood because it had never needed to ask permission to exist. She stepped out of the car and felt the shift in atmosphere. Not danger in the obvious sense, but regulation. The air itself seemed organized. Security was present without being visible in a crude way. Cameras were placed where they did not interrupt aesthetics. Guards stood at distances that felt accidental unless one knew what to look for. The staff moved quietly, efficiently, their expressions neutral, their attention trained on tasks rather than people. No one stared at her, yet she felt observed from the moment her foot touched the stone. Evelyn did not enter as a guest. She entered as an asset being transferred from one controlled environment to another. The contract had been finalized that morning in a law office that smelled of leather and disinfectant. Her signature had dried faster than her understanding of what she had agreed to. The language had remained polite, even generous. Protection, stability, discretion. The words had been chosen carefully to sound like care, but every clause pointed in one direction: compliance. Inside the house, the space opened into a vast hall filled with light filtered through architectural precision. Nothing was excessive, yet nothing was personal. Art hung on the walls, expensive and tasteful, chosen not to provoke emotion but to signal refinement. Furniture was arranged to encourage posture, not comfort. Even silence felt intentional, shaped by design rather than absence. Evelyn was shown to her room by a woman who introduced herself only by function. The room was large, serene, and flawless. Neutral colors, clean lines, a bed that looked untouched by sleep. On a dresser sat a small arrangement of personal items Evelyn recognized. Her suitcase had already been unpacked. Her clothes hung in the wardrobe, sorted by color and type. Shoes aligned precisely. Jewelry placed into velvet-lined drawers she had not yet opened. The invasion was gentle enough to almost feel thoughtful. Almost. She walked through the room slowly, touching nothing at first. The windows overlooked the property's grounds, a wide expanse of green that ended in trees and privacy fencing. From this height, she could see the paths curving through the gardens, each one designed to guide movement without making it obvious. There were no dead ends, but there were no shortcuts either. Her phone rested on the nightstand, screen dark. When she picked it up, she noticed immediately that something had changed. Notifications were quieter. Settings adjusted. Certain apps no longer appeared where she remembered them. Her email inbox looked cleaner than it should have, messages already sorted into folders she had not created. It was subtle, plausibly accidental, and unmistakably intentional. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed and felt the weight of the place settle into her spine. She thought of the contract again, of the way it framed restrictions as privileges. She was free to move through the house, free to attend events, free to access resources most people would never touch, but none of it belonged to her. Every freedom existed because it had been granted, and anything granted could be revoked. Nathan did not appear immediately. That, too, was deliberate. Instead, a schedule appeared on a tablet placed discreetly on her desk. It outlined her days in clean blocks of time: meetings with legal advisors, consultations with a stylist, sessions labeled simply as orientation, dinners, public appearances, all spaced with careful attention to packing, leaving no obvious room for refusal, but also no explicit commands. The house did not demand obedience. It assumed it. When Nathan finally entered her awareness, it was not through confrontation but presence. She felt the shift before she saw him, the way staff adjusted their movement, the way the atmosphere tightened slightly around his proximity. He crossed the hall with the same composed certainty she remembered from her mother's house, as if walls and people aligned themselves around him without instruction. He did not touch her. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His attention was measured, clinical, assessing how well the transition had gone. His gaze moved over her appearance, not with desire but with evaluation. She was not being admired. She was being checked for compliance. In public spaces of the house, he was immaculate. The perfect host, the perfect benefactor. The man who had taken responsibility when no one else would. The narrative formed itself effortlessly, reinforced by the staff, by the estate's quiet authority, by the documents that framed everything as generosity. Evelyn understood quickly that resistance here would not look like rebellion. It would look like instability. Any emotional response she allowed herself would be interpreted as weakness, stress, grief not yet resolved. And weakness invited intervention. Her days filled rapidly. A woman introduced as an image consultant explained expectations with a smile that never reached her eyes. Which designers suited Evelyn's new position? Which colors photographed well beside Nathan? How to walk, how to pause, how to let silence work in her favor during conversations with donors and investors. Every lesson was delivered as advice. Every correction phrased as support. She learned how to sit beside Nathan at long tables without touching him, how to mirror his stillness, how to smile without warmth. She learned when to speak and when silence would make her appear composed rather than absent. She learned that the role she was being shaped into was not that of a partner, but of proof. Proof of his stability, proof of his morality, proof that his power created order, not damage. The most unsettling part was how little force it required. Meals were served at precise times. She was asked about preferences, and those preferences were noted, respected, implemented. The illusion of choice was maintained carefully. If she said she did not like something, it disappeared. If she expressed interest in something, it appeared the next day. It was attention without intimacy, care without affection. At night, the house remained quiet, too quiet. She slept alone in the vast bed, surrounded by softness that did not belong to her. The sheets smelled faintly of something neutral, professionally clean. She did not cry. She did not allow herself that release. She knew that cameras did not need to be in her room to track patterns. Staff noticed everything. The system noticed everything. On the third day, she realized that the doors did not lock from the inside. Not completely. They closed, but they could be opened from elsewhere. She tested it once carefully, turning the handle just enough to feel resistance, then release. Her breath caught. No alarms sounded. No one appeared. The house did not react because the house did not need to. Control did not require drama. Nathan remained distant, appearing mostly in shared spaces or during scheduled events. He spoke to her rarely, and when he did, his words were efficient, neutral, focused on logistics. He did not explain himself. He did not threaten. He behaved as if the situation required no justification. That was when Evelyn understood the true shape of the danger. It was not that Nathan wanted to dominate her emotionally. It was that he did not need to. The system he had built did that work for him. His calm was not restraint. It was certainty. The estate functioned like a closed circuit. Lawyers visited regularly, reviewing documents, updating files, always courteous, always precise. They addressed Evelyn with respect, but never as an equal party. Her presence was acknowledged, her agency assumed rather than confirmed. Everything was framed as mutual benefit. Outside the house, the world continued to see what it was meant to see. Articles appeared about Nathan's philanthropy, about his commitment to family values, about the way he had stepped in to support a grieving woman after tragedy. Evelyn saw her own image begin to circulate, carefully curated, her expressions softened, her story simplified. She became part of his narrative without ever speaking a word. One evening, standing alone in a corridor lined with glass, she caught her reflection and barely recognized herself. Not because she looked different, but because she looked contained, polished, framed, like something already archived. She began to notice the smallest things, how her steps echoed differently in certain hallways, how staff never entered a room without knowing whether Nathan was present, how the temperature in shared spaces adjusted subtly when he arrived, as if the house itself responded to him. The rules were never written on walls. They were absorbed through repetition, through reward, through the quiet removal of friction. There was no need to punish her. The environment discouraged defiance by making it inconvenient, isolating, exhausting. Evelyn thought of escape often, but not in the dramatic sense. She imagined walking out the front door, past the gates, down the long private road. And then she imagined the aftermath: legal pressure, financial collapse, public narratives turned against her. The house would release her easily because it would follow her everywhere else. At night, she replayed her mother's last months in her mind, seeing them differently now. The calm that had seemed like relief, the order that had appeared suddenly in chaos, the way fear had been replaced by resignation. Evelyn wondered how long her mother had lived under similar rules, how many decisions had been presented as choices while already made. The realization settled slowly and heavily. This house was not meant to hurt her. It was meant to reshape her until resistance no longer occurred to her as a viable option. And the most terrifying part was that it was working. By the end of the first week, Evelyn moved through the estate without hesitation. She followed the schedule. She attended the meetings. She smiled at the right moments. The system rewarded her with smoothness, with ease, with the absence of conflict. It taught her that compliance felt better than fear. Nathan watched from a distance, his presence steady, his expectations unspoken. He did not need to rush. Time was on his side. Contracts aged like wine. People adjusted. Evelyn stood one evening at the window of her room, looking out at the perfectly ordered darkness beyond the glass. She understood then that this was not captivity in the traditional sense. There were no bars, no locked doors, no raised voices. There was only structure. And structure, when built by someone who never lost, was more powerful than force. The house did not ask her how she felt. It did not care. It did not need to. Feelings were inefficient. Rules endured. And somewhere within that immaculate, controlled silence, Evelyn felt the first true fear settle into her bones. Not the fear of Nathan Crawford himself, but the fear that if she stayed long enough, she would stop wanting to leave. The first sign appeared as a mistake too small to justify fear. A side corridor light remained on long after midnight, casting a thin strip of white across the marble floor where darkness usually ruled. Evelyn noticed it while returning to her room, her steps slow and careful out of habit rather than caution. The house was never loud at night, but it was never careless either. Every system functioned with quiet precision. Lights did not stay on by accident. She stopped, listening. The estate breathed around her with controlled stillness. Climate systems hummed softly behind walls. Distant security checkpoints blinked in measured intervals. Nothing suggested intrusion, yet something had shifted. The air felt disturbed, as if the house had briefly forgotten itself. Evelyn followed the corridor, not out of curiosity, but because ignoring anomalies had already taught her to disappear inside herself. She had learned that the system rewarded silence, but it also depended on it. This time, she did not look away. Near the service wing, she saw the second sign. The technical entrance door, normally sealed and alarmed, stood ajar by a fraction. Not enough to draw attention from cameras, but enough to break the illusion of absolute control. Damp footprints marked the tile just inside, irregular and hurried, leading away from the door toward a section of the house she had never been guided through. Her pulse quickened, not from panic but from recognition. This was not disorder. This was deliberate evasion. As she moved closer, the lights flickered once, brief, almost imperceptible. The cameras in the corridor went dark for less than a minute. Evelyn did not know how she sensed it, but she did. The absence of surveillance felt heavier than its presence. She turned the corner and came face to face with the man who should not have existed. He stood partially in shadow, tall but worn down by it, his posture alert in a way that came from experience rather than training manuals. Blood darkened the sleeve of his jacket, already drying. His face bore the marks of someone who had learned to endure rather than recover. He did not reach for her. He did not retreat. He assessed her in the same instant she assessed him. This was not a trespasser. This was someone who knew the house. His name surfaced in her mind before he confirmed it through action rather than words. Marcus Reed, former head of private security for Nathan Crawford. A man whose sudden disappearance had been quietly erased from public records after an incident no one officially acknowledged. Evelyn had heard whispers about him in town before arriving at the estate. Whispers that stopped when anyone important entered the room. Marcus moved with practiced efficiency despite his injury. He closed the door behind him without fully sealing it, leaving the option of escape open. He kept his distance from Evelyn, not as a gesture of respect, but as a calculation. He knew where the cameras were, where blind spots briefly existed, how long he could remain unseen. He did not ask for help. That alone told her more than any confession could have. Evelyn realized then that the house had not failed. It had been breached by someone who had built parts of it. Marcus led her, silently, to a maintenance alcove shielded from most sensors. He did not explain why she should follow. He assumed she would. And she did, because something in his presence broke through the numb compliance she had been cultivating. He did not look at her like an asset. He looked at her like a variable. Up close, she saw the cost of his knowledge. His injuries were not fresh accidents. They were accumulated consequences. Bruises layered beneath old scars. A man who had survived systems by understanding them too well. He revealed information not through stories, but through evidence. A data drive left on a metal shelf. Printed pages folded and sealed against moisture. Financial transfer records bearing the Crawford Foundation's insignia, but routed through shell entities designed to absorb legal fallout. Security logs altered to remove names. Timestamps shifted just enough to pass audits. Internal directives marked confidential, outlining containment protocols for situations labeled as reputational threats. Evelyn understood the language instantly. She had lived inside it for weeks. This was not philanthropy. This was damage control. The most devastating revelation did not come first. It came last, delivered not as accusation but implication. Marcus showed her a set of documents tied to her mother's final months. Medical expenses covered not by insurance, but by discretionary foundation funds. Property liens delayed through legal pressure applied quietly. A clause activating upon death, transferring obligations seamlessly. Her mother had not been rescued. She had been managed. Evelyn felt the floor shift beneath her understanding of the past. Grief rearranged itself into something sharper. Her mother's calm, once interpreted as acceptance, now revealed itself as exhaustion. A woman who had chosen survival over resistance, hopping the cost would end with her. Marcus did not need to say what he believed. His presence said it for him. The contract binding Evelyn was not an isolated arrangement. It was a pattern. She realized then that her mother's death, officially attributed to natural causes, carried too many convenient outcomes. Debts frozen, assets transferred, silence preserved. Evelyn did not know if the death itself had been engineered, but she understood that it had been used. That was enough. Between her and Marcus, something formed that did not resemble trust but necessity. They were both anomalies within the same machine. He was the discarded component. She was the newly installed one. Both understood the danger of visibility. Marcus did not frame himself as a savior. He made it clear through his restraint that he expected nothing from her. He had come to the house not to expose Nathan publicly, but to confirm something for himself, that the system he had helped enforce had not changed, that it still consumed people quietly. Evelyn sensed that he had been watching the estate for days, maybe weeks, waiting for the right moment. Her arrival had altered the equation. She was not supposed to question the process. She was supposed to settle into it. Her existence, as someone still capable of doubt, made her useful. What unsettled her most was not what Marcus revealed, but what he did not. He did not explain how he had bypassed security. He did not name his allies, if any existed. He did not ask her to run or to fight. He only ensured that she could no longer believe the narrative she had been given. Before leaving, he disabled another camera briefly, just long enough to prove a point. Control here was not absolute. It was maintained through the assumption that no one would test it. When he disappeared the same way he had arrived, leaving no immediate trace, Evelyn stood alone in the maintenance alcove, the documents heavy in her hands. The house resumed its rhythm seamlessly. Lights stabilized. Cameras came back online. The system corrected itself without alarm. But Evelyn did not. She returned to her room with measured steps, her expression unchanged, her posture composed. Anyone watching would have seen compliance. What they could not see was the fracture running through her certainty. For the first time since arriving, she understood that the contract binding her was not designed to protect her from collapse. It was designed to contain risk, and she was not the protected party. Marcus's survival raised a question that refused to settle. If Nathan controlled everything, why was Marcus still alive? And why had he chosen now to step back into the house that had erased him? Evelyn lay awake long after the estate fell into its curated silence. The luxury around her felt thinner, more like a membrane than a shelter. She realized that the house had witnesses, not cameras, people. And some of them remembered too much. In the darkness, a new awareness took hold. She was no longer alone inside the system. She was observed by someone who wanted the truth to surface, not for justice, but because silence had already taken too much. The night had given her something dangerous, knowledge. And knowledge, in a house built on control, was the one thing that could not be tolerated for long. Nathan returned to the estate without warning, and the house reacted before anyone else did. Security protocols shifted quietly, patrol routes doubled, access points recalibrated. It was not a dramatic arrival. There were no raised voices, no visible anger. The system simply tightened, as if the property itself recognized its owner's presence and corrected its posture. Evelyn sensed it immediately. The air felt heavier, more deliberate. Movements that had once been optional now required confirmation. Doors took a fraction longer to unlock. Hallways were never empty. The illusion of freedom she had been allowed to inhabit since signing the contract thinned to something transparent and fragile. Nathan did not confront her directly. He did not ask questions that could be answered. Instead, he observed. His attention moved through the estate like a cold current, touching every surface without leaving marks. Staff members became quieter. Meetings shifted behind closed doors. Schedules appeared on Evelyn's phone that she did not remember approving, framed as recommendations rather than orders. Officially, nothing had changed. Unofficially, everything had. He acknowledged the security breach in the same way he handled all threats, by erasing their context. Cameras were replaced, not repaired. Logs were rewritten, not reviewed. The missing minutes in the footage were classified as system errors caused by weather fluctuations. The technical door Evelyn had seen ajar was sealed and welded, its existence quietly removed from internal maps. Marcus Reed's presence was never mentioned, not to Evelyn, not to anyone. Nathan's control did not rely on punishment. It relied on preemption. Medical professionals were invited to the estate under the pretext of concern. Routine evaluations, wellness consultations, psychological check-ins framed as support during a stressful transition. Evelyn was not accused of instability. She was encouraged to rest, to trust the process, to allow others to manage complexity on her behalf. Each recommendation came wrapped in care, every boundary justified as protection. Her movements were not forbidden, they were guided. Suggested alternatives replaced direct refusals. If she attempted to leave the grounds, transportation was delayed for reasons that sounded reasonable. Weather conditions, scheduling conflicts, security advisories. The estate never said no. It simply ensured that yes arrived too late to matter. At the same time, Nathan began preparing for something larger. The announcement arrived quietly, delivered through a calendar invite that appeared on Evelyn's device as if it had always been there. A philanthropic gala in New York City. A high-profile event attended by investors, politicians, and media outlets already invested in Nathan Crawford's narrative. The evening would mark a milestone for the foundation. It would also serve another purpose. Evelyn was to be introduced publicly as his future wife. The language surrounding the event was precise. There was no mention of contracts or obligations, only partnership, commitment, a shared vision. The story was clean, aspirational, impossible to question without sounding ungrateful or unstable. Once presented, it would solidify her role in a way no document ever could. She understood the trap immediately. Visibility was the final enclosure. After New York, she would no longer be a private individual navigating a personal crisis. She would be a symbol, a beneficiary of generosity, a woman rescued from debt and grief by a powerful man's compassion. Any resistance would be reframed as betrayal. Any attempt to leave would be rewritten as emotional imbalance. The system would not need to restrain her. Public perception would do it for them. Nathan played the public game flawlessly. He allowed selected journalists controlled access to the foundation's work. He leaked stories about long-term investments in struggling communities, carefully excluding details about land acquisition tactics and legal pressure. He positioned himself as a stabilizing force in uncertain times. Evelyn's presence would complete the image. Inside the estate, preparations accelerated. Stylists arrived to refine her appearance, emphasizing elegance without personality. Speech consultants rehearsed her reactions, not her words. She was coached on posture, timing, silence. She was not expected to speak much. Her role was to confirm Nathan's narrative through presence alone. Each adjustment felt small in isolation. Together, they formed a structure that left no room for deviation. In the margins of this carefully managed performance, Marcus continued to exist. He did not return physically. He did not risk another breach. Instead, information began to surface in fragments, delivered through channels that could not be traced back to him directly. Anonymous cloud folders appeared and vanished. Hard copies slipped into Evelyn's belongings without triggering alarms. The system noticed inconsistencies but could not locate their source. The material was damning, not because it revealed crimes in isolation, but because it showed intent. Financial transfers tied to shell corporations that predated her mother's death. Legal correspondence outlining strategies to pressure property owners into selling under duress. Internal communications describing acceptable collateral damage. Her mother's name appeared again and again, not as a person, but as a variable. Evelyn saw the pattern clearly now. The foundation did not save families. It absorbed them. Nathan's calm intensified as the event approached. He became more attentive, more present. He framed their interactions as partnership building, guiding her through conversations about future plans, shared values, long-term stability. He never mentioned love. He did not need to. Ownership required neither affection nor cruelty, only compliance. What unsettled Evelyn most was his certainty. He did not behave like a man defending a fragile arrangement. He behaved like someone finalizing a transaction that had already been approved. The pressure tightened subtly. Legal reminders appeared regarding her obligations. Security briefings emphasized external threats. She was encouraged to avoid unnecessary contact, to preserve focus. The outside world began to feel theoretical, distant, something she had once belonged to but no longer accessed directly. Fear became a calculated variable rather than an emotion. Evelyn understood that if she moved too quickly, the system would respond faster. Exposure would not result in confrontation. It would result in erasure. Marcus's evidence, her credibility, even her safety could be reframed and neutralized. Nathan did not threaten her. He did not need to. The architecture of control spoke for him. As the date of the New York gala approached, Evelyn's internal questions shifted. She no longer wondered whether Nathan cared for her. That question belonged to a version of herself that still believed relationships were negotiated emotionally. Now she measured outcomes differently. She asked herself whether survival within this system required patience or rupture, whether waiting would grant her leverage or simply allow the narrative to harden beyond challenge, whether Marcus's continued existence was a warning or an opportunity. She understood that the public game was the point of no return. Once played, it could not be undone quietly. Silence would no longer protect anyone. Nathan prepared to claim her in front of the world, not through force, but through applause. And Evelyn realized that whatever she chose to do next would not be about escape. It would be about timing. The night before the New York benefit, the estate felt like a museum after closing time, polished, silent, and unforgiving. Every corridor was lit just enough to remove shadows, and every angle of the house seemed designed to discourage privacy. Evelyn moved through it carefully, not because she believed cameras could not see her, but because she had learned that the system did not need to catch her doing something wrong. It only needed to catch her doing something unscripted. She had not slept. Grief and adrenaline had braided together into a steady, brittle focus. She kept telling herself she was not the first woman to be trapped by a powerful man, and she would not be the first to misunderstand what power meant. Power was not a single threat. It was the ability to turn every option into a trap and then call it a choice. What she found began as an accident. In the guest suite that had been assigned to her, her mother's personal effects had been arranged in neat rows by staff who called it kindness. The jewelry box was cleaned. The notebooks were stacked. The old purse was emptied and refilled with tissue paper to preserve its shape. It was all sanitized, as if the past could be made safe through organization. Evelyn had hated it the moment she saw it, but she had pretended to accept it because pretending was how she survived here. She opened the purse again, out of irritation more than hope, and felt something resist her fingers where nothing should have been. A seam that was thicker than it looked. A lining that had been stitched twice. The discovery made her pulse slow, not quicken, as if her body recognized the difference between random fear and real information. Inside the lining, she found a thin envelope, worn at the corners, sealed with old adhesive. It had not been hidden carefully. It had been hidden desperately. The paper smelled faintly of damp and perfume, a ghost of Louisiana clinging to it even here. She unfolded the contents slowly, expecting a confession, a letter, an apology, anything that would read like a mother trying to explain the impossible. Instead, she found something colder and more useful. Names, addresses, short notes that looked like a map rather than a farewell. There were references to local officials, legal contacts, a private investigator's firm, and 2 out-of-state numbers written with sharp pressure, as if her mother had been afraid the ink would not survive. At the bottom, written in her mother's hand, there was one line that changed everything. It did not plead for forgiveness or ask for understanding. It stated a single fact, blunt and unfinished, like a sentence cut off before the end could be written. Her mother had tried to get out. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the list until the words blurred. The sensation was not comfort. It was rage sharpened into clarity. The contract had never been an act of surrender. It had been an emergency measure, a last resort taken because someone had already tightened the rope. She was not inheriting a debt. She was inheriting a captivity that had been carefully laundered through legal language. For several minutes, she did nothing. She simply let that truth settle into her bones because she knew it would change how she moved. If her mother had been coerced into signing, then there was no agreement to honor. There was only a mechanism to defeat. Evelyn began working with the calm discipline of someone who understood that heroism was a luxury. She did not fantasize about running barefoot into the night or screaming for help. She pictured the headlines Nathan could buy and the testimonies he could manufacture. She pictured her life reduced to a cautionary narrative about grief and instability. She pictured Marcus Reed disappearing in a way that would never be officially acknowledged. She did not need dramatic courage. She needed leverage. The evidence Marcus had fed her over the past days had been fragmented by design. He had never given her a single file that could destroy Nathan on its own, because he understood how quickly a single leak could be buried. Instead, he had built a lattice, transactions connected to shell entities, signatures that repeated in different contexts, dates that overlapped with suspicious legal actions in Louisiana. Evelyn had spent nights memorizing the structure, not the details. Details could be erased. Structure could be proven. Now she added her mother's list to the lattice. It became a missing piece that made the pattern unmistakable. Nathan's foundation did not only acquire land through money. It acquired compliance through pressure, and it maintained silence through fear. She moved carefully through her own digital devices. She copied what she could without triggering obvious alerts, using methods she remembered from an old corporate job, duplicating files into innocuous folders, creating backups that looked like routine document archives. She made redundant copies because she assumed the first set would be compromised. She embedded critical items inside harmless-looking files because she assumed anyone searching would be looking for direct evidence, not disguised fragments. She avoided the estate's Wi-Fi entirely. She avoided the phone network. She treated every connection as a confession. By early morning, she had assembled 3 separate packages of information, each incomplete on its own but devastating together. The first focused on the land acquisition network in Louisiana and the way her mother's property had been used as collateral in a larger scheme. The second focused on financial transfers tied to Nathan's foundation and the shell companies that insulated the money from direct scrutiny. The third contained the most dangerous material, internal communications that revealed intent, and one time-stamped record that suggested her mother's accident had not been accidental. Evelyn knew she could not send all 3 at once. She also knew she could not trust a single ally. Anyone she chose could be bought, threatened, or simply frightened into silence. She needed to distribute risk. The names on her mother's list were a starting point, but they were not guarantees. Evelyn chose one contact who seemed least connected to local politics and most likely to fear reputational damage. She sent a partial package through an intermediary attorney in the nearest city, a professional with enough credentials to be useful and enough ambition to be unreliable. Evelyn structured the communication so that the lawyer could not hold the information hostage without implicating himself. If he tried to bury it, he would be burying proof that he had received it. It was not trust, it was containment. She kept the second package for a more public channel if she needed it later, something that could not be quietly negotiated. And the third, the most sensitive, she held close, because she understood that releasing it too early would trigger Nathan's most efficient response. He would erase her credibility before the world ever saw what she was trying to say. Marcus remained the variable she could not control. She had no safe way to contact him directly. Even thinking about him felt dangerous because her mind kept trying to assign him a role: rescuer, lover, accomplice, threat. He was none of those in a pure form. He was a man with his own survival instincts and his own scars, and his presence had taught her a truth she could not unlearn. Nathan's world had casualties, and the casualties were not always dead. Evelyn's fear for Marcus was not sentimental. It was strategic and brutal. If Nathan identified Marcus as the source of the leak, he would not bring him to court. He would make him disappear in a way that left no legal trace, and the story would be rewritten as the removal of a dangerous intruder. Evelyn needed Marcus out from under Nathan's reach, but she had no authority and no resources. She had only timing and the ability to create pressure. She decided that if she could force Nathan to focus on public optics, she might be able to create a narrow window for Marcus to slip away. That required her to behave exactly as expected, at least until the moment she chose not to. By noon, the household shifted into gala mode. Staff moved faster. Security became more visible. A stylist arrived with carefully selected clothing and insisted on precision. A dress that communicated elegance without rebellion, jewelry that looked expensive but not aggressive, hair that suggested stability. The instructions were presented as support, but Evelyn recognized the deeper purpose. The more perfect she looked, the harder it would be to believe her if she tried to speak. Nathan's presence returned to her orbit with a refined intensity. He did not storm through the house like a villain. He moved like a man executing a schedule, and that was worse. He did not need to persuade. He needed to finalize. He introduced new documents late in the day, as if they were an afterthought. They were framed as protective measures, standard clauses for asset security and privacy. Each page was written in a language that sounded neutral, professional, even benevolent. But Evelyn could read the architecture beneath the words. The clauses tightened her obligations, not through direct imprisonment, but through consequences. They threatened penalties that would bury her in litigation and debt. They expanded confidentiality requirements in ways that could criminalize her speaking about her own life. They positioned her as a beneficiary of Nathan's generosity, and therefore as someone with a moral duty to protect his reputation. They included an emergency medical authorization that gave Nathan unprecedented power over decisions that should have belonged only to her. It was not a marriage contract anymore. It was a collar made of paper. Nathan did not have to say what would happen if she refused. The system said it for him. If she resisted, the house would become smaller. Her mother's property would be seized. Her distant relatives would turn on her. Local officials would whisper that she was unstable. The foundation would issue a statement about mental health and grief. The press would frame Nathan as a patient man burdened by a tragic story. Evelyn would become the problem the narrative solved. The threat was not violence. It was annihilation by reputation. Evelyn felt something inside her go cold in the cleanest way. She stopped hopping for a version of this where she could keep everything and simply be free. She understood now that she was choosing between two kinds of darkness. One darkness was elegant, controlled, and survivable. It would keep her alive, well-dressed, financially secure, and spiritually erased. It would demand obedience and call it partnership. It would never bruise her skin, only her identity. The other darkness was chaotic, risky, and possibly fatal to her old life. It would involve sacrifice and fallout, and it would not guarantee safety. But it was the only path that did not end with her becoming an object inside someone else's story. She looked at the documents and recognized the trap's final refinement. If she signed, she would be consenting to her own disappearance as a person. If she refused, she would trigger Nathan's response before she was ready to withstand it. The choice was not about courage. It was about timing. Evelyn signed nothing. Instead, she used the evening's preparations as cover. She allowed the staff to dress her, to style her, to shape her into the version Nathan wanted to present. She allowed the process because it provided a rare privilege in this house: movement without suspicion. No one questioned her walking to a different room to retrieve an accessory. No one questioned her needing privacy to change. No one questioned her request for a moment alone, framed as nerves before a public event. In that window, she hid her mother's envelope where it would not be found during a casual search, and she repositioned her backup devices in locations that would survive if her room was cleaned. She prepared a final transfer, a fail-safe release that could be triggered if she lost control. It would not destroy Nathan fully, but it would create enough noise to prevent him from burying the story quietly. She also took a risk she had avoided until now. She placed a single physical marker in a location Marcus had once indicated as a safe route through the estate, something small and meaningless to anyone else, but visible to someone who knew what to look for. It was not a message. It was a signal that the timing was changing. As dusk settled, Nathan approached her with the calm satisfaction of a man who believed the outcome was guaranteed. He did not look like a captor. He looked like a benefactor about to accept public gratitude. Evelyn met his attention and let him see compliance on the surface, because she understood that surface was the battlefield he controlled best. She gave him stability. She gave him silence. She gave him the appearance of agreement. Inside, she made her decision with a clarity that did not feel heroic at all. She would not let the gala become the moment she was claimed permanently. She would walk into the public game not as Nathan's trophy, but as a fuse placed in his carefully constructed theater. She would not explode blindly. She would wait for the precise second when his need for control would become his weakness. And if she had to burn her own life down to keep herself from becoming her mother's unfinished sentence, she would do it without witnesses, without pleas, and without asking anyone's permission. Because by that night, Evelyn understood the only truth that mattered in Nathan Crawford's world. No one rescued anyone here. People survived by choosing their own darkness first. The end did not arrive as a dramatic collapse. It unfolded the way systems fail when pressure is applied in the right places, quietly at first, then all at once. The gala in New York proceeded exactly as Nathan had planned, at least on the surface. The venue glowed with curated elegance, the kind designed to reassure donors and intimidate dissent. Crystal lights reflected off polished marble, and every detail reinforced the narrative of stability, generosity, and benevolent power. Nathan moved through the space with practiced ease, a man accustomed to being admired without being examined. Evelyn walked beside him with the same composure she had learned to perform inside the estate. She did not resist. She did not falter. She wore the version of herself the system expected, because the system had taught her that disruption only mattered when it came from a place of credibility. The first fracture appeared not in the room, but outside it. Hours before the event reached its peak, a limited set of documents began circulating among people who were trained to recognize patterns rather than headlines. A federal auditor received a carefully curated packet that did not accuse, but questioned. A journalist known for slow investigations and airtight sourcing received access to a timeline that connected land acquisition, shell entities, and legal coercion across state lines. The material did not scream scandal. It whispered inevitability. The timing was precise. Too early, and Nathan's legal team would have buried it. Too late, and the gala would have sealed his image beyond challenge. Evelyn had released just enough information to trigger curiosity without revealing the full scope. She understood that powerful men were not undone by accusations. They were undone by attention they could not control. Inside the venue, Nathan sensed the shift before anyone spoke to him. His phone buzzed once, then again, the interruptions subtle but persistent. His smile did not change, but his focus narrowed. He was a man trained to read rooms, and the room was beginning to behave differently. Conversations paused when he approached. A donor asked a question that was framed as casual but carried weight. A foundation board member requested a private word, citing a message received moments earlier. Nathan adjusted. He always did. He reassured, deflected, promised clarification. He leaned on his reputation, confident that the story would bend the way it always had. What he did not anticipate was Evelyn's stillness. She did not cling to him. She did not seek reassurance. She did not play the role of the grateful partner. Instead, she began to move independently through the space, engaging selectively, listening more than she spoke. She positioned herself where she could be seen without being controlled. It was not rebellion, it was presence. When a journalist approached her, she did not volunteer information. She acknowledged the question with calm neutrality, neither confirming nor denying anything. That restraint made the interaction impossible to dismiss. When an auditor's representative requested a future conversation, she did not decline. She deferred, leaving the door open without stepping through it publicly. The system noticed. Nathan noticed. His response was immediate and familiar. Accounts were flagged. Access permissions were altered. Advisors began positioning legal frameworks that would isolate Evelyn financially and socially. Statements were drafted that framed her as emotionally overwhelmed, struggling with grief, in need of privacy and support. The machinery of containment activated smoothly, like muscle memory. But this time, it encountered resistance from outside its own architecture. By the time the gala concluded, formal inquiries had already been initiated. Not accusations, not arrests, but requests. Requests for clarification. Requests for documentation. Requests that could not be ignored without appearing guilty. The Foundation's operations in Louisiana were flagged for review. The shell entities Marcus had identified were now under preliminary examination. Nathan's legal team began working at full capacity, not to win, but to slow the process. Evelyn did not return to the estate that night. She left the venue alone, escorted not by security, but by anonymity. She had arranged temporary lodging through channels Nathan did not control, using intermediaries who had no loyalty to him and no knowledge of the larger story. She did not disappear dramatically. She simply stepped out of the frame. Nathan attempted to reassert control through the tools he trusted most. He froze assets connected to her name. He initiated legal motions citing breach of contract and reputational damage. He prepared countersuits designed to exhaust her resources and credibility. He leaked narratives to selected outlets that framed the situation as a tragic misunderstanding exploited by opportunists. But the ground beneath him had shifted. The involvement of federal structures changed the equation. His usual strategy of quiet settlement and procedural delay no longer guaranteed resolution. The more he pushed, the more attention he attracted. Each attempt to isolate Evelyn drew additional scrutiny. The story refused to stay contained. Marcus disappeared exactly when the pressure peaked. There was no farewell, no explanation. One day his presence existed only in the past tense. Evelyn had anticipated this and accepted it without romantic illusions. In their world, survival often required erasure. Marcus had given her what he could: truth, leverage, and the understanding that some people could not afford to be seen at the end of a story. His absence was not a loss in the traditional sense. It was confirmation that the plan had reached its most dangerous phase. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn's life contracted and expanded simultaneously. She lost access to familiar comforts, social circles that had been contingent on Nathan's power, and the illusion of safety that wealth can provide. Friends disappeared quietly. Invitations stopped arriving. Her name became a point of tension in conversations she was not present to hear. At the same time, she gained something she had not possessed in years: autonomy without supervision. She lived cautiously, moving between temporary spaces, using resources that could not be easily traced back to her. She worked with investigators through attorneys rather than directly, understanding that visibility was both weapon and risk. She spoke when necessary, withheld when silence served better. She learned to exist without performing gratitude or compliance. Nathan's world did not collapse overnight. It fractured. Some of his structures survived. Others were dismantled under regulatory pressure. His reputation suffered irreparable damage, not because he was convicted publicly, but because he was no longer untouchable. Donors hesitated. Partners distanced themselves. The narrative that had protected him for years lost coherence. He did not disappear. Men like Nathan rarely do, but he no longer owned the story. Evelyn watched the consequences unfold from a distance, refusing the satisfaction of triumph. She understood too well what this kind of victory cost. She carried guilt for the damage that extended beyond him, for the people whose lives were entangled in the system she had disrupted. She carried grief for her mother, not softened by justice, but sharpened by understanding how little choice she had been given. Freedom did not arrive as relief. It arrived as cold clarity. Evelyn realized that the absence of ownership did not automatically create belonging. She no longer belonged to Nathan, to the contract, or to the narrative that had defined her. But she also did not belong to a simpler world where choices were clean and consequences limited. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Her life became quieter, smaller in visible ways, and heavier in others. She learned to sleep without security lights outside her door. She learned to trust her own judgment without validation from power. She learned that love, when tied to control, was indistinguishable from captivity. The final truth settled slowly, without ceremony. She had not escaped into light. She had chosen black freedom, the kind that offers no comfort, no guarantees, and no borrowed protection. The kind that demands constant awareness and accepts solitude as a price rather than a punishment. The kind that allows a person to exist without being owned, even if that existence is colder and harder than before. Evelyn did not romanticize what she had gained. She understood that this freedom would never feel safe in the way obedience once had, but it was real. And real, she had learned, was the only thing that could no longer be taken from her. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.